Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm both honored and kind of intimidated by the collective wisdom in this room, but I also, I feel during the Q&A, I'd really love to hear from some of you. I mean, certainly I'm happy to answer questions, but at that point, I will have just been speaking for 45 minutes. And so it would be a great opportunity, I think, to sort of crowdsource some of these ideas, because I think whether we're familiar with it or not, most of us actually do have some best practices around coping with some of the issues that I'm going to be bringing up, and it would be, I think, really productive to hear from others in the room, other strategies and perspectives that they might have used for coping with this emotional and psychological toll that many of us are experiencing in our age of crisis. So from the outset, I want to clarify that I do not come from a background in mental health or psychology, let alone environmental science. My PhD is in in English, but I kind of focus on environmental humanities, which focuses on how we represent and imagine and engage with the natural world through literature and philosophy and the arts. But it's actually that approach that sort of gave me the tools and the language to talk about these emotional and existential dimensions with my students, especially those in STEM fields who maybe felt that they couldn't talk openly about that pain in spaces that otherwise prioritize objectivity and dispassionate analysis. So I've spent the last 5 years at the University of Washington running a seminar that helps students develop these tools. So what I'm going to do is I want to start by reading a short excerpt from my podcast, Facing It, which offers a glimpse into how I first got involved in this topic, and also I think serves as a reminder of how we often end up in a place of despair. A student of mine once commented that if the university could monitor students' collective pulse rates, they'd station medics outside environmental classrooms. Given the way I taught in the first 10 years, such a measure may have been prudent. Like so many of my colleagues, I approached environmental issues by feverishly pulling items from the bottomless grab bag of ecological horrors and tossing them into students' laps like emotional grenades. Mass extinction and dying oceans, community displacement and melting ice caps, planetary arsonists elected to high office, the suffering of frontline communities, starving wildlife, burning forests, rising seas, and a diminished world for all who would come after us. However, it was exceedingly rare in those early years for me to pause and ask students how this material made them feel. In fact, I typically did my best to avoid this question, because whenever we did wander into that murky terrain, someone would end up in tears or start trembling with rage or grief. I took it for granted that such moments detracted from learning and steered around those digressions so we could quickly get back to focusing on the quote-unquote real content. I'll admit, however, that I was also seeking to protect myself. I felt emotionally and spiritually depleted by the outrage that can become a daily poison drip for those of us who address environmental and social justice assaults. How could I manage to keep teaching environmental issues across the decades when I myself felt so overwhelmed by grief? So this is partly what led me to question why our approach to problems like climate change and biodiversity loss have almost exclusively focused on the physical aspects, the external damage, without acknowledging the landscape of damage that we're carrying inside of us. Talking about dark emotional dimensions like this is not something that we have done in environmental circles until very recently. And one reason for that neglect is that we have primarily treated the environmental crisis as a science story. This is especially true for climate change, which is the area I focus on, where for the past 30 years, we have told that story using statistics and graphs and equations. And this is not to disparage scientists at all. You know, that quantitative approach is just integral to the discipline. But there are other ways to tell this story, especially when we step back from the data to remember that many of us are carrying a very deep or unconscious grief, because on some level we know that systems are unraveling and that there is more loss to come.
And as many of you might know, there has actually been an explosion of research on this emotional and psychological toll just over the last 4 years. A couple of years back, the American Psychological Association put out a major report defining eco-anxiety as a, quote, chronic fear of environmental doom. We also see these trends in popular culture. So for example, Google searches for the term eco-anxiety and climate anxiety were up 565% last year alone. Eco-anxiety was the runner-up for Oxford's Word of the Year the year before that. And the IPCC highlighted this in their most recent report, as well as the UN Development Program, where they wrote that, quote, mental well-being is under assault because of ecological breakdown. I almost always cite the definition of science writer Britt Ray, who wrote, quote, at its simplest, at this late stage in the climate crisis, eco-anxiety is merely a sign of attachment to the world. But all of these really are very general and umbrella terms. The way that eco-emotions are experienced in people's lives varies dramatically based on positionality, race, gender, privilege, your economic security or vulnerability. Are you indigenous? Are you an immigrant? Does your livelihood depend on extractive industries? An affluent white person may feel intense anxiety that's directed at the future or anticipated loss of a comfortable life, maybe also guilt for flying around the world, whereas someone who's watched the forests and their homelands destroyed and wildlife disappear might be experiencing something more like trauma and grief. So we need to be super nuanced and recognize that eco-anxiety is not one thing. So these are some basic categories that might help us think through dimensions of mental health and our ecological crisis. Sorry, the ones that are sort of muted there will come to light in just a moment. The first version that I've listed here, some of you probably know, solastalgia. This is a term that philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined to play on nostalgia, a longing for a time or a place that you can't go back to. But solastalgia happens without leaving a place. So as Albrecht wrote, quote, it is not about looking back at some golden past, nor is it about seeking another place as home. It is the lived experience of the loss of the present, a feeling of dislocation. In short, solastalgia is a form of homesickness one gets when one is still at home. So examples, I'm sure we could think of 1,000 here, right? Seeing fewer songbirds and pollinators or fewer stars at night than you remember as a kid. Maybe you used to look forward to the summer with excitement, but now that's kind of tinged with dread as you think about forest fires and heat waves. But there are also more acute forms of eco-distress. The second bullet here. Scientists as a group suffer from some of the highest rates of eco-depression, since they're the ones running the terrifying projections and documenting so much loss of our natural world. But it can be especially hard for scientists to cope with that when their own field puts so much emphasis on objectivity and detachment. And I have many friends who are wildlife biologists who say they just kind of feel a stigma around discussing subjective or emotional responses because it means they might be seen as unprofessional. Youth are another very prominent group affected by eco-grief, probably the most deeply. The data show that this is a global phenomenon. So in 2021, the largest research study ever done on mental health impacts of our environmental crisis among young people show that it is causing deep psychological distress. This was published in The Lancet after the team surveyed 10,000 teens from across the world. So this included Nigeria, Finland, India, Brazil, the Philippines. 56% of youth said they believe humanity is doomed. 1 in 4 are afraid to have children, and 77% characterized our future as frightening. This emotional harm is not just a matter of intergenerational inequality, but also a matter of economic and racial inequality. So among the respondents to that study, concern about climate change was specifically was concentrated much more heavily in poorer communities and communities of color. Just one example, in the Philippines, 92% of youth surveyed said that the future was frightening, compared with 68% in the US. And yet, of course, these are the groups that have contributed the very least to greenhouse gas emissions wrecking the planet. Our climate and biodiversity crisis is also disrupting people's identity, livelihood, and subsistence, especially people whose ways of life are closely tied to the land. So within many indigenous communities, the warming climate is wiping out traditional cultures and practices and relations, whether that's the decline of salmon and orcas right here in Washington State, or communities in the Arctic regions who can't travel to ancestral sites or hunt in the old ways because of the melting landscape. And I think when we talk about climate change as an existential threat, this really is a quintessential example, since it's not only a threat to life and survival, but also to people's culture, their relation to the past, and their entire worldview in which plants and animals are regarded as kin. But despite all of this research, I think getting people in conservation and climate work to take emotions seriously it's easier said than done. I myself get questioned for my focus on this topic, where people might readily agree that this rising grief and anxiety is alarming, but how is that our concern or our job? Isn't that something to deal with in the therapist office or for parents to deal with? And there are, in fact, dozens and dozens of reasons why we should pay attention to emotion in sustainability and conservation work, and I already heard many of them this morning. I'm just going to discuss these 5. So number 1, if we really want to address what's happening to our planet, we have to take a serious look at how we got here in the first place. Is it possible that our hyper-rational culture and an underlying failure of feeling may be a major factor driving this crisis? And how does that tendency to devalue feeling inhibit emotional connection with nature? Connection is, of course, inescapable. From our first breath in the world to our final breath, humans are embodied beings embedded in a complex web of interdependency. So every assault on the living world in some way emerges from the false idea of separation. And this is from, this report here is from 2022. I'm gonna reference it a few times today. And by the way, I'm gonna reference a ton of different books and research. You're absolutely welcome. If I see you pointing the camera up here, I'm gonna assume you're taking pictures for documenting that, so feel free to do so. But this report was produced by the Mindfulness Initiative, which actually started as a program of mindfulness training for members of the UK Parliament, but now it works with legislators around the world to integrate research on compassion and empathy and mindfulness into public policy. It's really exciting. And I included this line from their report, quote, "Environmental destruction is literally senseless. It reflects our collective feeling or failure to feel the harm we create. Implicated in this sensory failure is an internal rift. We are disconnected not only from our environment, but also from ourselves." I'm going to reread that one line. "Environmental destruction reflects our collective failure to feel the harm we create." And here's another quote from a member of the European Parliament reiterating that point. There are many of these in the report. So, I think that most of us or all of us can agree that a lack of empathy is destructive to other species and other people. But then if we look at the other end of that spectrum, what happens to those of us who feel too much empathy, who become overcome with pain and despair when we see other creatures or other people suffering? And among the students and activists that I work with, this is much more of a problem than the inverse, since these are folks who are choosing to devote themselves to this difficult work. So I've listed some helpful books that explore the phenomenon of empathetic distress or burnout, what used to be known as compassion fatigue. That latter term is actually falling out of favor among mindfulness educators who argue that compassion is actually a nourishing state. So they tend to use empathetic distress and find that more accurate. If you're interested in the neuroscience around this, as well as ways to cope, in addition to the steps that I will share at the end, I think these are some resources that might help. So on the one hand, there's a risk of being depleted ourselves. And then of course, there's also the risk of passing on that distress or even trauma to others, especially as educators. And I know that we've all faced this dilemma in our work with the public or with students. How do we strike that balance in communicating urgency and the scale of this cascading loss without making that content so painful that people end up shutting down? And this goes back to that classroom anecdote I shared where, I used to think that if students were sufficiently alarmed, then they would take action. And so it was my job to serve up the most kind of heartbreaking or terrifying projections. This is known as the scaring into caring fallacy, and it is still very pervasive in environmental education and research, particularly around climate change. But psychological research shows that despair is not an effective state for long-term engagement and can actually have the opposite effect of what we intend. And I do want to throw out the caveat here that fear actually and anger can be motivating factors that get people engaged at the outset. They can be quite effective in that regard. But of course, we have to keep in mind that we're going to be doing this work for the rest of our lives. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that a long-term strategy, and what are the risks around burnout? I also want to be clear that I'm not advocating that we shield people from the truth, because but there is a responsibility that comes with communicating disturbing content to also share resources and strategies that help those audiences process it so that they can channel that concern into meaningful action. And I promise I will circle back to offer some of those resources. A second issue that I work on with students around this emotional content is recognizing that the environmental crisis is a crisis of hope. And I think this largely emerges from our binary thinking around hope versus despair and doom. I'm sure you're all familiar with the label a climate doomer. Someone who says it's too late, we're already screwed. And I think that the responses that I see in the earlier slides, both in my own classes and in the research globally, shows how prominent that's become. A lot of scientists and activists are now arguing that the public, at least here in the US, jumped from denial to doom like almost overnight. And that has become the new big obstacle to motivating people. Michael Mann is probably the best known climate scientist in the US, and he spent decades in these media debates and legendary Twitter battles debunking all the most prominent climate deniers. But in his new book, he says that he's now redirecting all of that energy to rushing around debunking the climate doomers who say that it's too late to save ourselves. He calls this the new climate war. And this was hard for me to wrap my head around initially, but it makes more sense as explained by psychologists like Leslie Davenport, who identify both of these positions as a basic psychic defense against human discomfort with uncertainty and ambiguity. So we don't like to be in that in-between state where we're unsure what's going to happen. And so while that sometimes leads to disavowal and turning away, other people go towards doom, right? It's too late, can't do anything about it. And Davenport says that paradoxically, moving to either one of those places provides a kind of psychological relief because it gets us out of that gray zone where we're sort of staring into the void and having to sit with ambivalence and uncertainty. Then a third emotional challenge we face, and I'm sure all of you have seen this in your work, is this drop in the bucket imaginary. My students constantly say that their efforts feel pointless because one person's impact is just so minuscule compared to the scale of the crisis. So psychologists use the term pseudo-inefficacy. The root efficacy is, of course, simply the ability to affect an outcome. So inefficacy is the inverse. Pseudo means false. So pseudo-inefficacy is the false belief that you can't make an impact. And researchers use this to describe the phenomenon where people are less willing to address one problem or take one action when they are made aware of the broader scope of problems that they're not helping. So there was a series of really eye-opening experiments where psychologists gave people a picture and a description of a starving girl in need of food aid, and they asked for a donation. But then a second group was given the same picture of the girl, as well as given statistical information about millions of others in that region who were also at risk of starvation. And that second group that was given the statistics donated less than the group who only learned about the single little girl. So researchers concluded that people didn't donate as much when they were informed of the statistics because they felt any donation they made wouldn't make a meaningful contribution to solving the overall problem. And this experiment has been repeated in many, many contexts where people become immobilized by the focus on what remains out of reach, and that causes them to give up and not even help where they can. And of course, this is a false feeling of inefficacy because helping even one person or one creature matters. And so I love this quote, even partial solutions save whole lives. This has obvious implications for work in biodiversity and extinction. Of course, it doesn't mean that we should not use statistics and numerical communication, but that needs to always be paired with stories and testimony to feel less abstract. And I was looking through all of your literature, or some of the literature in your network before coming today. I was really, really impressed that it seems like all of you are already doing some of this by, using personal names and pronouns and traits and listing the birthdays of animals. I think even when communicating a really big topic, we want to strive to do that through local and personal examples where we can. A fourth reason to take emotions seriously is that emotional intelligence is just foundational to effective communication and engagement strategies. And I think I've already established this, but I want to add a few things here about the information deficit myth, as well as talking about these issues with both political opponents or perceived opponents and children. My own students make a very common mistake where they're getting ready to go home for the holidays and they know they're going to be debating their uncle who's a climate denier. And so what they do is they brush up on all the facts so they can just clobber him with the latest statistics. This is what sociologist Kari Norgaard calls the information deficit model, the idea that people just need more information and evidence to change their minds. And this does not work. In fact, people become more entrenched in their beliefs when they are nailed with information debunking their viewpoint because it makes them defensive, and that reinscribes a tribal identity. And this is really just basic psychology, right? I mean, even if you were aware that you might have some figure wrong or your opponent was correct about some fact or another, that matters far less than your belonging to a certain group with a shared identity. Right? I'm a small government conservative, or I'm an Oregon rancher, and that other group is my adversary. That is a much more powerful determinant than any factual discrepancy. So we need to shift away from the goal of winning an argument to the far better goal of building shared interests with people whose positions might be different than ours. Katherine Hayhoe is a climate scientist, evangelical Christian, and a communication expert who has been more successful than anybody at building rapport with conservative communities around environmental issues. And the number one principle that she advocates is to do less arguing and more listening to figure out what is it that makes somebody tick. And then once we know how an issue might impact that other person's life or align with their concerns, all we have to do is connect the dots between the values that they already have and why they would care about conservation or climate change or whatever. So if you don't know what somebody's values are, just ask them, right? Maybe they love winter sports or fishing or hunting. Perhaps they have religious views around stewardship or compassion towards the poor. They might be concerned about the health of their kids or the cost of extreme weathers or fires in the summer. And once we understand those concerns, it's really just a matter, again, of connecting the dots to show that they actually are already concerned about those issues. And we don't have to use words like biodiversity or climate change necessarily. Maybe we can use the language of wildlife, clean energy, pollution, and habitat loss. Those are words that play really well across political categories. And then finally, Norwegian psychologist Per Epson Stoknes has a lot of research showing that how we feel about the messenger is more likely to shape our decision to act than the message itself. We are more likely to accept information and solutions when it comes from people that we perceive as sharing our core values. So a conservative person who enjoys hunting and outdoor recreation could very likely care about ecological impacts, but they're also going to be skeptical about information and advice if it, comes from Al Gore. In the same way that we need to tailor strategies for talking across political difference, we also need to bring emotional awareness to conversations with children and youth. And I want to be very clear that this age group is not my expertise. I primarily work with college students, so I suspect there are many, many people in this room that are much more advanced in their understanding of this even than I am. So what I usually do is I just point people towards the experts because this is too important not to get right. I really recommend Leslie Davenport's new book here on this slide. This just came out this last year. Sarah Jaquette Ray, her book, the yellow one, is very good for young adults. It technically is an academic book. It's very, very well researched, but it's written to be quite accessible. And then the quote on the left is from Carolyn Hickman, one of the leading experts in eco-psychology around children, and I think her article might be a nice entree for those talking with children. That's the one. We need to find a way to talk about eco-anxiety. What I'll share here is two things that I hear like all of these researchers say. Number one, do not commit the scaring into caring mistake that I described at the opening. Kids are already concerned. In fact, they are way ahead of us in knowing how bad things are. But then second, given that pre-existing anxiety, when young people express their despair or anger, it is very crucial to validate those feelings. And I think this is the part we tend to neglect. And I have the same reflex I think many others do, that we want to assuage that fear. We don't want to feed into their perception that the world is ending. But we can really go too far in comforting reassurances, like, it's going to be okay, you're overreacting, or you're just a kid, you shouldn't have to worry about this. That really undermines trust, because young people see it as part of the same culture of avoidance and disavowal that has fed into our refusal to act with urgency over the past generation. And in fact, that study from the Lancet on global youth that I shared shows that the despair of young people has a very high correlation with a sense of being lied to by adults and being betrayed by governments who aren't doing what needs to be done. And so many of the youth surveyed in that study said that they actually felt that they could deal with the impacts of climate and environmental problems themselves, but what made it feel unbearable to them was that adults, the very people that are supposed to be protecting them, are minimizing their fears at best, or at worst dismissing and turning away entirely. And that to them feels like a betrayal. So what the experts recommend here is that we do acknowledge and validate those darker feelings. I understand why you feel this way. I'm worried too. This is unfair. This is scary. But then with that trust established, pivot, of course, to actions that they can take, solutions they can participate in, and very importantly, groups that they can connect with. And I'm going to share some of those in upcoming slides. Okay, so with all of that offered as a kind of overextended preamble, my most important offering here is this final set of points on how we might reimagine our relationship with eco-grief and anxiety. Because I see this as a key starting point for the process of building that existential capacity to cope. And I want to dive into this by reading one more excerpt from my podcast, Facing It, which explores how dark emotions might actually be a doorway into something powerful that we've forgotten in this whole conversation about biodiversity and our climate crisis. So in this particular excerpt, I'm reflecting on the course that I designed at University of Washington to help students cope. And what I found when I walked into the classroom that very first day was a room full of students who saw grief as a problem to be solved. And they wanted me to help make it go away. And that enabled me to recognize a misunderstanding that I had been carrying around as well. And these first images, by the way, are, oh, that's the podcast. These first images are from a student in this class. When I first launched my seminar on eco-grief, I was every bit as distressed as my students and looking for ways to extinguish my pain for all this suffering. But something unexpected happened along the way. I had always thought of grief as a bad thing, a dark state to avoid or overcome as quickly as possible. I thought that feeling grief was like succumbing to a preventable illness, or that once it took hold, I might fall into a bottomless hole of despair. But in time, it dawned on me that maybe we were seeking solutions to the wrong problem. We all wanted to fix the way we felt so we could go back to feeling happy. But grief isn't something to be fixed because it's not dysfunctional. In fact, it's a healthy and necessary process we have to undergo in order to heal. First, grief isn't one of many options for accepting loss. Grief is the process of accepting loss. I get why many people working towards sustainability want to sidestep emotional issues and push the public straight into action. The situation is urgent, and dwelling on our feelings can seem like an extravagance as the fires close in. But the problem is when we try to jump straight to the final step without first processing the emotional toll of all this lost beauty in life, we're bypassing the very insights that motivate us to fight for our world in the first place. Ignoring ecological grief is like trying to rush through any great loss, a job, a home, someone you love, without first pausing to acknowledge what you're leaving behind. And in all those cases, we're not just losing something we once had, we're also losing the future that many of us had counted on. We can't act creatively and honestly in this new reality until we mourn the passing of the old one. And all the ancient wisdom traditions affirm this truth, that grief is not here to take us hostage. It is the agent needed to transform us so that we can confront a similarly transformed world. Okay, so as the podcast seminar progresses, I really do, though, try to push beyond just reframing grief as something that's not bad, to also consider ways that it is actively good. Grief arises from attachment and love. You will not grieve for something that you don't love. And so when we feel that pain, we remember that our existence and well-being are deeply intertwined with other lives. So grief is an expression of empathy with other species or other people, and a way of honoring our connection with them. A student last year shared a quote from the Marvel Comics, which I never thought in my life I would be quoting in an academic talk, but it's quite profound on this point. This is where the character in WandaVision says, "What is grief if not love persevering?" Another one of my favorite quotes is from Malkia Devich-Cyril, where she wrote, "Joy is not the opposite of grief. Grief is the opposite of indifference. Grief is an evolutionary indicator of love, the kind of great love that guides revolutionaries." And recognizing this has been essential for my own students and other activists who've internalized this assumption that grief leads to inaction. You know, we live in such a grief-phobic culture that people automatically have this image of someone in mourning who can't get out of bed because they're so depleted by their pain. But when we remember that grief and love are necessarily two sides of the same coin, it not only helps us shake that stigma around grief, but it also puts us in a place where we're no longer squandering our energy by trying to suppress it and actually harness grief to rouse ourselves to action. So in other words, if we acknowledge all of this pain as arising from love, then we have the perspective to understand these twin feelings as allies in moving towards environmental justice. Because, I think love is really the most powerful motivator to fight for what we want to save. A second reason that embracing grief is so crucial is simply because our culture doesn't really have established norms for recognizing or mourning the loss of nature. And this is a problem insofar as mourning is a social process. We understand this in the case of familiar cultural norms around the death of a person. And there's a reason that cultures across the world and throughout the ages, when people lose a loved one, they turn to social rituals like funerals and vigils and memorials. People can join support groups or get help from books or therapists that specialize in bereavement. And it is the social nature of those rituals that validates our pain and removes our isolation from others, which again is healing in itself. But then if you feel grief for the death of millions of animals in a wildfire, or for the disappearance of snow on the mountains where you live, there really aren't any established social structures to acknowledge this. So this is what's known as disenfranchised grief, a kind of pain that is essentially made invisible, and that deepens the harm that we experience. And there are many folks now in the arts who are working to counter disenfranchised grief through acts of public mourning that bring visibility to unacknowledged loss. That last image I was at, this depicts the annihilation of the passenger pigeon as the tide rises over the sand. Another example is Remembrance Day for Lost Species, which has grown into a worldwide movement of community events commemorating extinct species. So you see these mourners carrying a replica of the world's last passenger pigeon to be burned on a funeral pile. And the other is a processional for the great auk, which was driven to extinction in the 1980s. Extinction Rebellion uses funeral symbolism like this, coffins and mourning processions. And if you think this is just fringe stuff, some of the biggest names in architecture and public monuments are now involved in these projects. Maya Lin became internationally famous. You might know her for designing the Vietnam Memorial and the Civil Rights Memorial. She's now working on a project called What is Missing, which documents the loss of animals and plants and habitats worldwide. This project is a multi-sided memorial with permanent and temporary installations. She also has a website with interactive features tracking extinction. I think it's a great one that you might use in your educational programming. And this particular installation you see here is in Manhattan. And it partly alludes to the island's woodland past. It's called Ghost Forest. But Lynn says that it also stands as a kind of slow-rolling funeral because she harvested these trees from New Jersey's coastal pine region barrens where the forests are dying from saltwater rot from rising sea levels. And so the trees here are still technically alive, but due to that saltwater exposure, they will die completely over the course of the next 2 years. Another really notable figure addressing disenfranchised grief is Ghanaian British architect David Adjaye. He's known for designing the Nobel Peace Center in Norway and the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History. And this project here, which is in the works at the moment, it's called the Biodiversity Beacon, where mourners will be able to come and pay respects to more than 800 species that have been lost since the dodo. I'm going to skip over some of these others. Chris Jordan is local here. Some of you might know. So the point of all of this is that, in a culture like ours that Jeremy Hance has called death-phobic and grief illiterate, these kinds of practices are cathartic. They allow intense feelings a safe release through ritual. And again, their collective nature removes isolation from other mourners, which helps shake us from denial. So I wanted to invest some time really in examining this before moving to the final points about steps to take, because I think we're not in a really good space to work through despair if we haven't first done the work of rethinking our relation to grief. Okay, so here's the checklist. And again, I think many of you probably have strategies of your own. I hope you'll share those in the Q&A. For the first one, the most powerful place to start is simply acknowledging and making space to talk about emotional responses. The obvious benefit, of course, is acknowledgement is a first step out of repression. I think we all know that repression is bad for us. But this is really more complicated than it appears at first glance. Because a huge part of people's depression and anxiety actually comes from feeling alone or isolated. And I constantly hear my students say that they feel like they're the only one who feels despair. They see their family or friends as kind of sleepwalking through the end of the world. And not only is that outlook personally distressing, but it is politically debilitating as well. The research shows that people who feel isolated are much less empowered to take action. And so that's why openly acknowledging these emotional responses is so important, that talking in itself creates a sense of community and solidarity, and really a recognition of how widespread these feelings are, and that counteracts isolation. In fact, when I resurveyed my own students at the end of the quarter, they said over and over again that the single most helpful thing about taking my seminar was being in the room with others talking about similar struggles and being heard when they voiced distress. So this can also, of course, go beyond just making space for talking. The morning rituals and memorials that I mentioned are incredibly powerful acts of acknowledgement. I was kind of thinking about what might be appropriate in the context of a zoo. Even if it was just about modeling this by featuring some form of memorial to either individual animals that were part of that community or to threatened species more generally. Are there ways that guests who wish to participate in that outward recognition of loss could be given some opportunity to express that? And one example I thought of from a group I recently visited, the organizers set up where what they called a weeping bowl, where anybody could write on a small slip of paper something that they were holding in their heart, an animal, a place, could it be the entire ocean? And after people added that to an altar, they were invited to take a stone and place it in this bowl that was filled right to the brim. And collectively, those stones caused the water to flow over the sides. And this was a really moving and cathartic experience for people. So that's the starting point, naming and acknowledging loss. The second point is about reframing. I've already talked about how we might do that with grief, but there are many other areas where we can recognize how a perceived deficit is something that might actually be quite empowering. So one is that, I encourage my students to see their eco-anxiety as a moral emotion. And reject any framing that pathologizes their feelings or suggests that eco-anxiety is a dysfunction. That, of course, just locates the problem in the individual instead of the social structure. I've actually recently heard a lot of people replacing the term eco-anxiety now with earth love. Number 3 is to rewrite the story. Humans live their lives by stories. They have real implications for the kind of future that we're going to create. Our perception that we are living in an apocalypse is really fed by political and economic institutions that present themselves as inevitable. And that gets reinforced when there aren't alternative stories. I think we all know that the genre of apocalypse is the one that really dominates our discourse about the future, whether we're looking at it in science fiction or Hollywood film or mainstream news. I really love Joanna Macy's analysis for this, where she breaks down the 3 dominant stories currently competing to define our moment. The first is the business as usual story, which wants to preserve the status quo and argues that economic growth, technology, and the free market will lead to prosperity for all. The second is the story of the great unraveling, which predicts ecological collapse, mass extinction, conflict over resources. This is obviously the dominant narrative of the climate movement. And then the third story is what Macy calls the Great Turning, which sees in our current moment the possibility of profound social transformation towards genuine sustainability and environmental justice. And Macy says that the point is not to argue over which of these 3 stories is correct, since they are all happening. Rather, the question is, which one do we want to invest in? So she writes that third story of transition, healing, and recovery is where we will turn when we acknowledge that the first story is leading to catastrophe, but we refuse to let the second story have the last word. And if you're interested in sharing any of this material that offers these alternative visions of the future, this is a great collection called Imagine 2200, Climate Fiction for Future Ancestors. It's a compilation of stories from writers around the world imagining these intersectional worlds of healing and community-based solutions. And they run a literary contest each year for the best stories, which are then published. And then the last 2, and I'm wrapping up in 45 seconds here. Number 4 is Connect. I talked about already how this helps build community. But the last thing I'll say is that, oftentimes our sense of despair isn't the crisis itself so much as a longing for fellowship or the absence of a sense of purpose in the midst of difficulty. So if you or your colleagues or your guests are looking for places to find that connection, you can go to the resources page on my website, where I've listed a lot of groups that either meet virtually or in person to have discussions and build community around eco-anxiety. And they're set up so that you can either take part in their meetings, or they will give you templates and instructions to facilitate your own. The Good Grief Network is fantastic. The Climate Courage Workshop is also great, very international. And then the final one, get engaged and take action. I should clarify, I usually share this checklist with students or the general public, and for today's audience, I think prompting you to take action seems redundant since you're working towards conservation solutions as your livelihood. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves that in a time of urgency, the temptation to jump immediately to action or to stay as busy as possible can be counterproductive if it's used as a way to avoid dwelling with hard feelings. So it's good to be mindful of that. But I'm also guessing that for many of you, when you talk to the public or maybe family or friends, you're asked the same thing that's the single most important most common question that I get in my Q&As, which is what gives you hope? And my answer to everybody in this is don't get fixated on cultivating hope. Hope will come if you do the work. And I don't tell that to people out of the belief that someone going to a street protest or joining a community garden will tip the scales itself. The most powerful element of getting engaged is that it builds solidarity. And cognitive psychologists tell us again and again, it is crucial to imagine ourselves as part of a team, because that addresses that problem of pseudo-inefficacy where we think our actions are too insignificant to matter. When we see ourselves working collectively rather than individually, we can recognize that all contributions sync up to a larger network of change. This is what Adrienne Marie Brown calls emergent strategy, a movement that spirals out from all kinds of small local actions and connections to create larger complex systems. So I'll stop there. My website is at that yellow box at the top, which also lists a lot of further readings, as well as all of the stuff that I just mentioned in my slides. And in terms of books for further reading on this topic, these are some of my favorites, and much of the material I shared today comes from these researchers, so I want to acknowledge the extraordinary work of my colleagues and friends featured here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great talk, and I love how you ended on that note of collaboration and working together, because that is what we do best. So now we are going to move to the question portion. We'll use the two mics again for folks here. I have the online questions, so if anybody has questions, feel free to go to the mics, and I'll start with one we have online. So the question we have to kick us off is, what sparked you or brought you into doing this work?
I think there were two things. One was the despair of my own students. So I was hearing again and again from them that going into environmental work seemed so depressing that they were actually considering dropping out of the major. And that to me was a huge red flag, right? That we as educators were actually doing harm in the way that I was trained, coming up with first hearing about climate change as a freshman in 1995 in college. It was like a wake-up call. I mean, nobody was paying attention to this at the time. And so there was this kind of sense that it was cultivated that what we needed to do was create awareness and share that urgency. And we can certainly overdo that to the point that it becomes, it just becomes so depressing that students no longer want to engage. And also when students are in, or young people or any of us are in a place of despair and hopelessness, our creative thinking is actually inhibited by that. Our ability to solve problems, to think long term. And so I think that the failure to really think about these emotional and psychological dimensions has been a huge failure of the environmental movement up until very recently, when we've started paying more attention to that. So I wanted to know more about this myself so that I could use these tools in my own classrooms. And then around the same time, this was like 2016, 2017, it's hard to keep track of now. There's just so many fires in California, but there was a series of wildfires that destroyed the areas around where I grew up. And when I went back to visit those places, it was like a death in my family. And I really recognized how much this loss maps on to other forms of grief. I was simultaneously caring for my father, who was dying of cancer, and it was really kind of hard to disentangle these two events, sort of the loss of the wildlife and the forests in my home, and the loss of my father to cancer. And what I recognize is what anybody will tell you that does this work around eco-grief is that the strategies for coping are very, very similar. And they should be, right? There's no reason why we should say that, you know, the loss of any beloved creature, you know, depending on species, has to be dealt with in completely different ways. So those two things really got me involved. Actually, it was when I heard about the Good Grief Network, which uses this 12-step process, which is actually based on Alcoholics Anonymous. And they emerged out of Utah, interestingly, and have grown into a nationwide movement. It's a really, really helpful one if you're thinking about either joining or facilitating your own. They're very, very good in sort of providing the materials and the steps for people to facilitate their own conversations around eco-grief.
Great. Any questions from the audience? Oh.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I was wondering, for rewriting the story, how do you disrupt storyline A that was essentially like our current systems will solve the problem, because we're kind of operating in that current system now?
Yeah. I mean, I think that reality is the greatest corrective to that. We can look around and still see massive inequality, injustice, systems unraveling. Almost any metric really shows that the areas where the free market is operating in an unregulated manner are unraveling. The areas where we do see hope and solutions really are around more kind of communal and alternative practices. And I think that convincing people that, you know, capitalism is not the solution is it's tricky, because I do think that there is a role that technology is playing. There is a role that the free market is playing, and even corporations. And we see this around clean energy technology and a lot of shifts in the way that we're now thinking about environmental destruction as just being bad for business. But I think it's a real kind of failure if that is the motivation and the rationale, because we can always backslide into a place then where if it no longer is good for profits to take a sustainable action, then of course that gets undone by the system itself. I think it's less problematic when we're talking with younger generations, because I think that they are more kind of critical of the status quo and the business of usual model that thinks that just economic growth and global free trade is gonna lift everybody out of this eventually. But I think that one of the reasons, again, I mean, just like you say, everywhere we look, we see that story kind of reinforced for us. But at the same time, I think it just takes a little bit of effort. Part of it, I think, is because of the way that our media saturation ends up determining the way that we frame the problem, right? And we have to remember, of course, that mainstream media outlets are profit-driven enterprises, that they can't survive unless they can capture our eyeballs and our attention. And this is how we get caught into these doom scrolling loops, right? These more sensational stories of fires and apocalypse are the ones that we are most drawn towards and compelled to see. Whether that feels good or bad, it does feel bad, but it's almost impossible to sort of disentangle that, because we have this sense that knowing what's going on sort of ensures our own survival in times with so much upheaval. So I think it's important to sort of take the effort to deliberately look for those alternative stories, and there are aggregators that will actually make this available for you. One organization I really love is GRISTS, which is local here to Seattle. They have a daily newsletter called The Beacon, and they will send you to your inbox a good environmental story or a positive piece of news every day. The other organization is called the Solutions Journalism Network, that will tell you not just about the problem. And it's not to say that they're sugarcoating it or they're denying the bad news, because they still will tell you that part. But what they will include is the part that is left out by the mainstream media most of the time, which is how are people responding and what kinds of solutions are they coordinating. And that actually, it's not just about making us feel good by looking at those solutions, but providing a template that has worked in one situation that can then be applied to another.
Okay, another question from the virtual audience. So, have you considered eco-anxiety and the disability community? Often with medical needs, unfortunately, use of single-use plastics are required for daily management, similar to the use of straws, becomes an issue. So this also causes eco-anxiety, and folks with disabilities feel like they are continually contributing to the climate crisis.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it speaks more to this kind of shaming of individual behaviors as a way to work ourselves out of the problem, which is incredibly politically debilitating, right? Of course, BP invented the carbon footprint because they want us to focus on ourselves as the problem and our own personal consumption patterns. And that really redirects attention or deflects attention away from these more systemic drivers of the problems. So I think being aware of the way that sort of culture of shame and individual responsibility and accountability has been deliberately manufactured by the fossil fuel industry and other entrenched interests in order to protect the status quo is probably the best way of sort of helping oneself work through that sense of guilt or shame or being stigmatized by others, to realize that really is a political strategy that is not conducive to the kind of collaborative, social, more kind of political solutions that we really need to this problem, as opposed to those individualistic approaches.
Okay, I think we have about time for about one final question. Ian, you want to go?
You definitely have like a lot of awesome resources, and this is probably in there somewhere, but something that I've personally always noticed when talking with guests and trying to get them engaged in issues is there's definitely a huge generational difference in how receptive they are, or even just getting them like a little bit engaged. And definitely it works like you were saying, don't do things that immediately get them defensive, because then you'll go nowhere. But like in your talks or writings or anything, have you ever found anything that has been like especially helpful with engaging like older generations a bit more?
Yeah. The research has shown over and over again that for folks who are sort of resistant to pro-environmental or pro-conservation, pro-climate initiatives or actions, those folks it helps if they're parents. So if they don't have children or grandchildren, this is not as an effective a strategy, but people are most influenced by their kids. So those children are going to be the best messengers back to their parents. So, I mean, it's a tricky situation, because we also don't want to put children in the position of they have to sort of, and they hear this over and over again, like they're the ones that are going to save the future. That is something that they really resent hearing, because, well, why are you putting all of the hope and responsibility on me? I didn't create the problem. Also, I can't even vote. I'm not a business leader. And it's a way of sort of deflecting the problem. But I don't actually think that they don't even need to be sort of armed and deployed to go and convince their parents of that these issues need to be taken seriously. They will tend to do that on their own if they have the awareness and have the tools. But what I think it's important, though, is if they are approaching their parents, that they're not just sort of reciting this doom and gloom narrative, but that they're actually aware of organizations, solutions, and ways to get engaged. Because a lot of times that's going to be the point where the parent would also get engaged alongside, even if they're accompanying them in a begrudging manner, that in and of itself can be a hugely transformative experience. Yeah, it's a great question.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for your excellent talk.